Excellencies, distinguished guest, distinguished speaker of today's afternoon's panel, dear colleagues, dear professors, dear students, and dear participants of this very interesting conversation between two prominent scholars of international relations. On the behalf of the Faculty of Social Sciences at Corvinus University of Budapest, I would like to welcome you here at Corvinus University. And first of all, let me say a few words about the university, and let me thank this opportunity to the Danube Institute, because it is a joint project together with the Danube Institute, and we really appreciate this opportunity to bring in foreign expert of international relations. We have to say that in our cooperation, this is the first and very important step, and we do very much hope that in the future we will host many very similar conversations between different scholars. The primary aim of our university is the internationalization strategy. Currently we have a bachelor master in international studies, and we are very proud of its position in the Hungarian and foreign ranking, and often we organize kind of academic conferences, joint researches. Just to remind you that last year we gave a honorary doctorate to the General Secretary of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, last September. He was here in the main hall of the university. So we have to say that this is a very important step in the life of our university, and we really appreciate the role of the Danube Institute, which played a very prominent role in organizing this event about America's decline or rising America. It depends on the expert's view, of course. And I would like to invite now the head, the director of the Danube Institute, John Sulivan. Please, the floor is yours to open and moderate the event. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, Dean, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I want to begin by thanking you, not only for that, but also thanking the faculty of this University of Social Sciences at the historic Corvinus University for the generosity in holding this event with the Danube Institute. It's a combination of two organizations, one well established, one very new, and we're hoping that this will be the start of an extremely fruitful collaboration. Now, the topic, of course, is America and national decline. I'll say more about that in a moment, but I believe that this event will be an intellectually stimulating and enjoyable one. But as you may have already deduced from the number of people on the platform, I have to announce one disappointment, and that is that Joseph Joffe, the editor of Die Zeit and the author of the new book, The Myth of America's Decline, has had to cancel at the very last moment. Lufthansa has a strike on its hands. Hamburg Airport is expected to close. I wonder if the microphone has got a strike on its hands too. Well, I'll carry on, I think, unless there's a technical expert at the back who is able to improve matters. Lufthansa has a strike on its hands. Hamburg Airport is expected to close, and he had to go directly back from Zurich in order to be sure of meeting a long string of obligations. We at the Institute and at the university are naturally disappointed, but Dr. Joffe really had no alternative, and we look forward to his speaking later in the year here. In the meantime, may I suggest that Dr. Joffe's absence is an excellent reason for buying his book, which is on sale here, courtesy of bestsellers. Bestsellers Bookshop and also on sale at the bookshop itself in October the 6th Street. You know, the great Edwardian essayist and novelist Max Beerbohm once turned down an invitation to dinner with an even greater novelist, Henry James, because he just bought a story by James and didn't want to delay the pleasure of reading it. I suggest on this occasion, ladies and gentlemen, that you emulate the example of Max Beerbohm, not to the extent of buying the book, but not to the extent of going home to read it rather than listening. Because there are two remaining holders of the conversation on America tonight, James C. Bennett and Zoltán Gálik. It takes only two to tango, and it takes only two to hold a conversation. I'm the moderator of it too. Mr. Bennett and Mr. Gálik are ideal interlocutors in such a conversation. Mr. Bennett is, like Dr. Jaffe, the author of an important new book on the future of the United States. Its title is America 3.0, and it too is also available here and at Bestsellers. Mr. Gálik is well known at this university, I don't need to introduce him, and at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs as a leading strategist of Euro-Atlantic relations. Before handing over the lectern to our two guest speakers, however, I have one duty to perform. The first is that I've been asked to say a few words about the Danube Institute. My short answer is that we exist because Central Europe needs to have a better, it needs to be better understood in the world, and in order for that to happen, Central Europe needs a better understanding of itself. That understanding should not be a narrowly partisan one. We at the Danube Institute have a point of view. We are free marketeers in economics, conservatives in social and cultural policy, and Atlanticists in foreign policy. We're devoted to advancing and discussing these ideas here and throughout Central Europe. But we're equally encouraged to encouraging debate between conservatives and classical liberals on the one hand, and between them and their democratic opponents on the other. We hope to arrange, stimulate, and take part in such debates. Now, it may be somewhat presumptuous of me to say this because I've lived in Prague and Budapest for only 5 years, 5 of the last 6 years. But I sometimes think that Central Europe has too little debate and too much partisanship. We hope to change that balance by encouraging more debate. At the very least, both sides may then understand why they differ and perhaps even see something of the other's point of view. And we hope finally to provide a three-way transmission belt for these ideas and for a great deal of other information between Central Europe, Western Europe, and the English-speaking world. It's absurd that a region so rich in history, culture, and the arts of civilization as this one should attract the attention of Western Europe and North America only when a revolution threatens to disturb their peace. This conversation is, even in its smaller size, this conversation tonight, even in its smaller size, is a good example of what we hope to do. Mr. Bennett is an American thinker and social critic who is somewhat skeptical of postmodern institutions such as the European Union in its present form. Dr. Gálik is a strategist who believes in the necessity of a more integrated Europe to deal with the dangers of a world which, as we've just seen, is still very capable of throwing us surprises. We obviously will learn in a moment of how they differ in their judgment of America and its supposed decline, and how to deal with it. Even before the developing crisis over Ukraine, the growing fiscal, economic, demographic, and strategic problems of America, intensified by what some people regard as the paralysis of its political system, have led many people who would reject anti-Americanism altogether to express anxiety about the future of the United States. Russia's actions towards Ukraine and also towards international law have underlined not only the importance but also the urgency of America's future, because America's future, however it develops, will help to determine Europe's future too. The debate tonight will begin in a moment. It will last, the two speakers will speak for something like 20 minutes, 25 minutes. I will then throw open the discussion to the floor, and we will terminate the debate at in about an hour and a half. It's slightly shorter than we'd intended, after which you can join us for a glass of wine and also perhaps to buy the books, having been stimulated by the debate. So on behalf of the Danube Institute and Corvinus University, I have very great pleasure in inviting James C. Bennett to initiate the conversation on America and decline. by addressing us. Jim.
Pleasure to be in Budapest. I should say that I grew up in the American Midwest in an area with a great many Eastern European immigrants and quite a few Hungarian immigrants. My own family has Hungarian relatives by marriage from the immigrant population. So I grew up with Hungarian names, food, music, and etc., not being totally strange to me. As a matter of fact, I always liked the food quite a bit. And, but I had never been here before. So it's both very, very new to me, but in some ways very familiar. So the first thing I noticed changing planes at London, at Heathrow, and getting on the plane and watching the passengers get on, was that the faces were sort of very familiar. They were very familiar from the Midwest. And I said to the seatmate next to me, said, you know, this could be a bus in Chicago from the faces of the people. And he said, I am from Chicago. So, okay. And he was a Hungarian coming back to visit his family. So there's always been this Hungarian-American tie, which is in some places very real. And you know, we had many refugees from 1956 in our town growing up. I heard the stories firsthand, and you know, that was significant. So on the other hand, it's also strange to be in a country where usually when I travel, I know, you know, the basics of the language of the country I'm going to. I can usually read some of the signs and know what is on sale in the stores from the signs and that sort of thing. And I'm a Hungarian, I'm just about zero, so it's in some ways kind of makes me feel like a little child wander around. But fortunately, everybody has such good English, so it's not a problem these days. Anyway, given that this is a university, and I'm always very happy to come to a university and talk, I thought I might start out by giving a bit of the story of how I came to my own opinions, because I didn't take the usual route of a scholar or a professor, neither of which I have any formal credentials in. I did go to the University of Michigan. Had a very pleasant and fruitful education there. My major topic was anthropology. My minor was political science. Also studied a good deal of history. And then I went to do a variety of things. The non-academic employment for anthropologists is virtually zero. So I did many other things and ended up, also had a great interest in space exploration. Ended up being the co-founder of one of the very first companies formed to build and launch rockets on an entirely private basis. And I ended up handling the public policy, legal, regulatory affairs for that company as one of its co-founders. Eventually, we went through reorganization, ended up with a second company of the same business. I ended up being president of that. It was a very, very instructive experience, and the technology is now being used, that we developed is now being used, for instance, with Richard Branson's enterprise, Virgin Galactic, and in several other companies. I am still part of my time a consultant in the private space industry in the US and in Britain as well. So I have my hand in that. But I also got very involved in the debates over public policy about technology development, industrial policy, and entrepreneurship. And I started to, at one point, do a study on the successes and failures of industrial policy, decided to take 3 countries and examine the differences between them. The US, which I was quite familiar with, France, which has a very interesting aerospace industry run on classical continental European lines with a great deal of government planning and involvement and in some cases operation. You're all familiar with how that works in general. And I thought my third case would be Britain because they had a very active aerospace industry. And my general assumption was the standard assumption in political science at that time is that Britain is sort of halfway between Europe and America in its public policy and its systems and its economic principles. And in the 1960s or 70s, you could see why somebody might see that. But examining the history of the British companies and how they developed and such, I came to the conclusion that Britain was more like about 90% like America and 10% like Europe. And I started to get interested in why this should be the case. and did a great deal of research into the roots of entrepreneurship and the roots of industrial and public policy, and why some countries are good at entrepreneurship and why other countries have not done so well at entrepreneurship. And in some cases, some have done well in one period of time and not very well in other periods of time. So what made the differences between the eras in which they were very good and the eras in which they were good, which comes to the question of why countries have successful times, why they have, when do they see leadership in the entrepreneurial field, and when do they fail. Stay away from it entirely. And that gets to the topic of the talks tonight. Is America in decline? If so, why is it? If not, how can I defend it not? And what are the implications for other countries? To what extent should they or could they take the same route that America has, or should they avoid it and try to find an entirely different path? The first part of the question, let's take it this way, is America in fact in decline? And if so, why? I was going to be expecting to follow Mr. Joffe, and I expected that this part of my talk would be very easy because I would say, Mr. Joffe wrote a really interesting book, and I agree with just about everything he says, so what he just said, I agree with on that topic, and I will not touch it any further. Well, I can't do that, thanks Lufthansa. So, I will try to very concisely go over the ground that he did in his book, and I do recommend that you read his book as well as, of course, mine. And because we said pretty much the same thing, which is I do not believe America is in decline. I think, as he pointed out, there is a huge amount of reserve strength in America in the sense of economic critical mass, technological capabilities, business capabilities, banking capabilities, etc. We have slightly reduced our share of global GDP, but actually not very much over the last 10, 20, 30 years, despite the enormous rise of Asia. The rise of Asia has been primarily at the expense of Europe. And Europe has lost, I think, about 10% of the share of the global economy that it used to have, and has shrunk, I think, from like 25 to 15. He does a very good statistical job of analyzing that. So it's really been a matter of America more or less staying where it was, Europe declining as a percentage of world output, and Asia, obviously particularly China, but also the so-called Four Little Tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, the big dragon, and of course Japan, which has been stagnant, but it hasn't been declining enormously. So it's really two big items, European decline, and of that it's been mostly continental European decline, because Britain has done a fairly good job on new private job creation. It's continental Europe, which has been basically nil. They have only created as many private jobs as they have lost, so there's no net gain in private employment on the continent. This is the most worrisome statistic. I think that given the roots of entrepreneurship, new company starts is one of the most important metrics. And Europe has not been very good at new company starts, and of that, most of them have been in the UK and Ireland. And America has slowed down since 2008, but I think that this has been mostly a matter of some very specific policy problems that have arisen in the United States relatively recently, and those could be corrected relatively quickly. And the other is coming to the unique part of the book, the part that does not touch on what Mr. Joffe wrote and discussed in his book, is that my co-author and I have come to the conclusion that some of the problems that America and the world in general is experiencing are the results of basically we're at the end of one era and the transition into a new era, and it's a disruption of the same magnitude as the end of the agricultural era, the pre-modern era, and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And that is why the book is called America 3.0, because in our analysis, America 1.0 was the original colonial America of the agricultural economy, of 97% of the population living on farms, and the dominant mode of production being either in the north, the individual family farmstead, and in the south, the plantation. And even there, it was only one part of the south that was plantation. But, you know, the world was an agricultural world. The industrial fabrication was a very small part. With the rise of power machinery and the assembly line and such, agricultural employment fell to under 1% in the United States. I think some of the countries of Europe, France, for instance, I think is still at about 20, but that's only through highly artificial means, such as the Common Agricultural Program, which basically subsidizes a substantial part of the population to stay on farms to avoid further aggravating the industrial unemployment problem. We are seeing a transition in the mode of production from centralized mass assembly line manufacture to highly decentralized local production. The most visible and sort of exotic form is the so-called 3D printing or additive manufacturing, where, you know, basically small units the size of a computer printer lay material layer by layer to create three-dimensional objects. This is already used widely in prototyping and in a few cases in production. I think this can become one of the mainstays of production in the future, which means that instead of things being produced centrally and then distributed over very large areas, for instance, containers going from China to America and Europe, filled with all these small manufactured objects, they will exist in software form. They will be downloaded to a 3D printer, either in your house or in your neighborhood, and produced on demand, on need, and each one of them can be customized. There are other things besides 3D printing which have the same effect. The highly decentralized, small, numerical, computer-controlled manufacturers, the computer-controlled lathes and such, can do the same thing as subtractive manufacturing, which is the traditional take a block of metal and subtract the unneeded material until you have what you want. This may sound like not much of a revolution, but it will be you know, as much a revolution as the computer printer did to the centralized printing industry, which has greatly reduced the need for that. This will change the traditional employment base. This will change industrial relations. This will change the scale at which capital must be accumulated to start an enterprise. And in this, particularly the cultures that are more conducive to individual enterprise, to new start entrepreneurial enterprises, to rapid shifts in the way of doing things, will be at a further advantage now than they have been over the past 100 years. And this suggests that the various countries, America will do reasonably well, although it is being disrupted, it will be disrupted, but the typical American economic relation, at-will contracts, ease of starting companies, ease of exiting companies, the social acceptance of corporate bankruptcy as a normal part of life and not a disgrace, for instance, all make a very rapid, fluid economic system. The continental European system would seem to have a hard time adapting to this era. You're already seeing, you know, I noted the lack of new company starts in continental Europe, the lack of easy fluidity of corporate forms. Now there is entrepreneurship in Europe, certainly, and in the software area where the barriers to entry are lowest, you see, you know, certainly a good deal of creative stuff going on. If you can build on that base and expand it, the more, let's say, the more you can do that, the more competitive continental Europe will be. And it's interesting that in some areas, you know, there's been quite a bit of creativity in software coming out of various parts of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Just Skype, for instance, coming out of Estonia. I understand those people used to program nuclear warheads for Soviet submarines before they changed. They have gone on to do more productive things now, fortunately. The roots are there, but the institutions right now work against it. And it's going to be a problem everywhere, including in the United States. But I think the US has the potential to work through these transitional problems more quickly and more easily than many other countries. China has some advantages and a great number of disadvantages in facing this new situation. If this transition is to be the case, then the traditional Chinese tactic of doing fairly ordinary manufacturing but at low wage rates has come to the end of its ability to be competitive. In other words, if you produce something by downloading a piece of software to your 3D printer and pressing the print button, there's no wage advantage in having a Chinese person press the print button because you're doing it for free and they can't get cheaper than free. Plus, you would have to ship it from China to the United States or Europe, and that drives its price, which is already close to free in 3D distributed manufacturing, even lower. So their traditional economic strategy is going to be in a good deal of trouble. Now, they can adapt, and in fact, they can adapt by, for instance, specializing in those areas that won't be subject to 3D printing. They manufacture very large, very complex objects, for instance. Although right now, the US and Europe are leading in those kind of things. For instance, a competitive jet airliner. There's only two places in the world where competitive jet airliners are made, and that's the US and Europe. That won't be subject to 3D manufacturing very quickly, shipbuilding, that sort of thing. On the other hand, they could just go to a much more autarkic economy in which there is not that much export, but they use 3D printing to satisfy consumer demand in China. That's possible. But their social institutions, which are very, well, it's a communist totalitarian state, despite the fact that you now have this crony capitalist class at the top, and that's not known for flexibility of institutions. So it is, in my mind, a great question mark. Similarly, Japan, which has quite a different system, they are, you know, to their credit, a democracy and a relatively open society. Again, they may surprise us by an innovative adaptation to these new circumstances, but we can't tell. In other words, we're coming into a time in which there's very large question marks. I think America, because of its various reserved strengths, and because it is a traditionally open economy and social system, which adapts fairly quickly, will probably come out okay. I have a hard enough time giving policy advice to the United States on how to cope with this. I'm fairly reluctant to give policy advice to other countries, which I do not understand as well as how they should deal with things. I've looked a fair amount at the rest of the English-speaking world. They tend to share most of America's strengths in regard to adaptation, in regard to relatively open and fluid economies, relatively little encumbrance on company formation, and on shifts in labor patterns. So I think their labor mobility will be an advantage to them as almost as much as the United States, perhaps even more, because they're all smaller countries, population-wise, than the US, and smaller countries may be more flexible. So I think the English-speaking world will continue to at least preserve its position. I think that in terms of lines of alignment, obviously in a world where there's much less transport of physical products over long distances because there's no longer much need for it, regional blocks based on geographical closeness become much less important. That's why I've been an advocate among the English-speaking countries of greater free trade, labor mobility, et cetera, among the English-speaking countries because the transaction costs of movement between them are already so low, and because they have similar attitudes about law, labor practices, et cetera. So it's relatively easy for an English worker, for instance, to go to an Australian or an American factory, come in, not just because of the language, but also because their attitudes towards how a workplace is run. It's relatively easy for an American or a Brit to join a startup in each other's countries, again, because of the general attitudes towards how you do a startup, how relations are within the startup. I was on the board of a small software company in Northern Ireland. I found it extremely easy to go there and do business in terms of the relationships with the people. I'm not sure to what extent that would be true outside of the English-speaking world. So I have been, in general, an advocate of more open and flexible relations. I think that certainly we should re-examine the whole idea of the European Union as a customs union or as a homogeneous organization. You are trying to build an organization there across quite different cultural patterns and systems, especially with regard to some of the things that are going to count quite a bit. Like I say, labor relations, the idea of when and how you start a company, the legal forms under which it's done. And for instance, I've been an advocate of the UK forging a new relationship with Europe outside of the EU customs wall, partly so that they can have greater corporate and labor mobility between themselves and the other English-speaking countries. This shouldn't be done to the detriment of genuine flow between UK and continental Europe. Certainly, I'm an advocate of continued free trade, continued free movement, and in general, continuing to lower the barriers. But I think that, you know, for instance, here where you're looking, when you look to the east, you have to question whether the customs wall of the European Union to the countries to the east of you is to everybody's advantage. I think the very idea of that someday Ukraine might join the European Union and be within the EU customs wall against the countries to its east was an alarming idea to quite a few people, both in Russia and even eastern Ukraine. We all know that in reality, Ukraine was very, very far from being a candidate for actual EU membership, and it was perhaps you know, an imaginary problem in that sense. But if you could pioneer a status of relationships that were not unique to the European Union, that a country could have free trade, close trade in all directions, not just in the EU direction, that would have been less threatening and probably is more of the model of the future. If the United Kingdom has an upcoming, you know, depending on politics, an upcoming referendum on EU membership in 2017, if they pioneered a status which allowed free trade and free movement between itself and the continent, but not excluding other relationships, that could very well be a model that would be useful for other countries on the periphery of the EU. And if the UK did it, you would not say, well, this is a second-class status. You would not say this is a consolation prize for the people who did not win the prize of European Union membership, which, as we know, has both costs and benefits. How are we on time, John?
Well, I was going to say, if you could speak for another 3 or 4 minutes, and perhaps before you sat down, you might like to just deal with some of the points you were making in the book about the internal kind of political deal that would have to be done in the United States. So another 4 minutes?
Okay. I mean, basically what we're trying to work towards is if this idea of the transition to a new era beyond the Industrial Revolution, new forms of labor and social relationships have to be forged appropriate to this era, just as we had to when we went into the Industrial Revolution. This requires a reform program both in the United States and in other countries. And many of the problems that are cited by people who say the U.S. is in decline are actually artifacts of going into this transitional era, because the U.S. is furthest along in the transition. It has the most visible problems, but that does not mean that the rest of the world is not going to encounter these problems as well. It's just as if Britain was experiencing the problems of the Industrial Revolution in the 1830s and the 1840s. Same people were saying, well, thank God we don't have those problems here on the continent. Well, you had them 20 years later. And so you have to look at how Britain handled them. Similarly, you have to look at how America is going to handle these itself. The United States itself is over-centralized. The United States itself has gone into fairly bureaucratic barriers to creation of new corporations, legal, financial, et cetera. And in the last 10 to 15 years, they've been very regressive, which is one of the reasons why entrepreneurship is mostly now happening in software and is lagging behind in physical, technological innovation, where it does not have to be that way. It's a strictly regulatory artifact. We need a reform of the finances in the United States because the US, like many other countries, has run up an enormous debt, which is not going to be paid on time in real dollars worth anything. So we have advocated what we call the big haircut, which is American slang for a financial reform in which all creditors give up a certain percentage of what is owed to them in order to increase the assurance that it will be paid at all. This happens in the private sector all the time. What we're saying, this will probably happen in the public sector. You can already see it in American states like Wisconsin, which has begun that process with a great deal of strife and weird things happening, like state legislators crossing state lines. They wouldn't be part of the quorum and all this. Reminds me of the story about the old Polish parliament, where they kidnapped one of the members who he couldn't be present to veto a bill when they had the Liberum veto there. We're seeing that now in the States. Anyway, my book goes into what a reform program looks like a great deal. Decentralizing a more open employment system, and the US is already more open. Returning more power to states and the municipalities for the things that need to be done, and reducing a great many of the sort of established interests where people have carved out positions basically paid for by the public one way or the other to their private benefit. And this has encrusted the US economy quite a bit, although these are, you can see these everywhere else in the world, and in many cases they're worse. Reform program for the rest of the world goes along similar lines. In other words, to reduce state power, to attempt to plan, because they usually don't plan very well, to open up more individual initiative. There's an anthropological side, which we get into as well, which is sort of why the English-speaking countries have always had a sociology and anthropology that was more individual-oriented than many continental societies. There's a good deal of social science research now over the last 30 years by people like the English scholar Alan McFarlane, the Czech-English scholar Ernst Gellner, and the French demographer and sociologist Emmanuel Todd, and people taking after him like the French demographer Gilles Duranton, whose work has kind of ironically been sponsored by the European Union. And this again shows that the individualism in the English-speaking countries is a fairly deep-seated historical phenomenon. It is not, as Marx thought, erroneously something that happened at the transition from the peasant to the individual society in the 16th century. It goes back as far as possible. And this is one reason why the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain first and the United States very quickly thereafter. But nevertheless, what this implies is that the adaptations to what is in America the 3.0 era, you may call it whatever you want in other countries because you don't have exactly the same sequence, but it is a transition that is coming. The adaptations won't be exactly the same in other countries as it will in the United States or the United Kingdom. And what it will be is, it'll be a matter of a local debate, and I don't think we don't have the time or depth to get into it here. However, in conclusion, my book goes into this idea, whether we are going into a new era, whether the problems that are attributed to American decline are actually problems of transition, whether America has a particular set of remedies for these problems that will get us past the current problems, which I believe essentially we will, because the dice are loaded in our favor. Our historical roots give us some particular strengths. And the final message is I am, pushing for an international system that gives every country the latitude to find its own way to deal with these problems in a manner that's most compatible with its own history and particular form. So a certain amount of humility in American foreign policy, that we should not assume that every aspect of America needs to be transplanted to every other country. So with that, I'll leave you.
Thank you very much. Now, can I turn over the microphone, please, to Dr. Gálik?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So this is indeed a great pleasure for me to be with you here today, and I was thinking on why we are so interested about these two books, and I think I can give two reasons what is important here at this university. The first is that we have to deal from a theoretical perspective on the decline or the hegemony of the United States. And we have a lot of lectures here which are dealing with the international community, with the international relations. I am an associate professor here at the university at the International Relations faculty, so I can assure you that almost every day we are speaking about the United States, and not when only we speak about the United States foreign and security policy, but when we this afternoon were speaking about the European Union and about the problems of the European Union, the sovereign debt crisis or the world economic crisis, then the first thing was to deal with the United States and why the United States has the enormous power to influence the European crisis handling, for example. So that's one perspective, and the other perspective is, of course, from the perspective of Hungary and from the perspective of our region, since we have to deal with the United States, and the United States is the hegemonical power of the world, and I think she will be the hegemonical power for long years, and I think we just have to examine why it is good for Hungary, why it is good for the region to have this kind of position in the international order. So, as I said, if we are speaking about international relations, and if we are speaking about the role of the United States within it, then we have to keep in mind that the stability of the international system requires hegemonical power or a single dominant state to articulate and enforce the rules of the international order. And I think if we are speaking about the United States, then we have to conclude that the United States created a very successful international order after the Second World War, which transformed in some ways after the Cold War, but I think that transformation didn't put the United States in a declining phase. But we see that the United States was able to transform herself and the international system during that 50 years. And there were some very hard situations where it was very hard to create that transformation, but in some cases it was very successful. So as I said, the United States, if he wants to act like a hegemonic state. He has to be empowered to and the capability to enforce the rule of the system. He has to have the will to do so, and of course a commitment to the system which is perceived as mutually beneficial to other states must be in mind if he creates that system. And of course the United States have to be a very large and growing economy, or a stable economy, to do this. And of course they have to establish that hegemonical regime, and the other states have to be sure that they can move in that international system. So I think the United States did it in the past, and if we just seeing the 3.0 America in this book, then I have another idea, and it just reminded me to Keohan's 3.0 international order, which the United States did, and which was very similar in comparison to that book, and it concluded that that transformation from the 1.0 to the 2.0 to the 2.5, 3.0 was very successful, and I think that book, which put these questions in another perspective, concluded and was almost the same conclusion, that it was very successful. So as we said, and we can ask what is the probability of doing such a successful transformation, and how the United States did it in the past, and how can we compare to this hegemonical line to the past hegemonical experiences. So we always compare the United States, and we always conclude that this decline won't occur within decades, because if you just compare it to the Portuguese, to the Dutch, or to the British hegemonical experiences in the past centuries, then we can say that the United States has the power to move on a very similar line to these powers. So, for example, if we are speaking about the recent big decline, about the British decline, then we can make a distinction between the decline of the real and the trading of goods and the real sphere, and on the other hand, on the monetary sphere. And we can say that, for example, the British Empire collapsed in the beginning of the 20th century, and the real and the trading of goods and the trading of services, but collapsed only after 1920 or 1930 in the monetary sphere. And we can say that the United States hegemonical line is very similar to that one, although the United States is not reaching the top of that monetary line yet. So if we just compare the United States hegemonical pillars after the Second World War to the British one, then I think the United States created a very strong and long-lasting hegemonical situation. So, and if we try to analyze the declining of that, then we have to just say that the United States hegemonical power was put in a three-pillar system. The first one was the international order, and we can say that the rule of law, the international rule of law, the United Nations, and all the necessary instruments which were necessary to maintain the order within that situation. The second was the so-called international liberal trading system which the United States created and maintained for a lot, although it has some very strange perspectives, but, and I will speak about this if we are try to analyze the declining of America, but with the World Trade with the General Agreement of Tariff and Trades, with the IMF, with the World Bank, and all the other institutions, they created that pillar. And the third one was the military power of the United States, and we can say if a state wants to be a hegemonic player, then it needs the force to enforce the rules of the international system. And if we want just to analyze how that is functioning today, then we can say that the United States went through very hard times during the Cold War and after the Cold War, but it successfully managed the situation. So the United States is unique in some ways. So first, for example, as for the international system, the United States created a very highly protective economy since the labor cost of the United States is very high. And the United States maintained that position for long, although he was in the position to allow the other states to function in the liberal order. The other interesting thing, if we are speaking about the possibilities of the United States in the future, it is the so-called Leontiev paradox. The United States is very rich in capital, and although he is doing very extensive export on the agricultural field, and she's one of the biggest exporter of machinery in this field. The United States is very unique because she was the only country on the international system after the Second World War who created an extensive and an intensive economic development at the same times. An extensive, since the size of the United States allowed to make extra profits on the economy of scale, and he was able to do this during the decades, and at the same time he created the intensive development path as well. So he was able to do big scientific developments and transformations. After that, we can say that the United States successfully managed the transformation of the global monetary system. So as we know, the Bretton Woods system was transformed many times after 1945. So if you just think on the IMF reform in 1975, or before that, the United States chose the convertibility in 1958, or for example, the Washington Consensus in the beginning of the 80s, we can say that the system which fundamentally transformed was successfully managed by the hegemonical power after that. So I think the United States is very unique in these situations, and if something will happen in the future, then we can expect that the transformation could be smooth, or she can handle this situation. So, but really, what is the basis of the hegemonical theory, which says that if somebody wants to maintain the position, then it needs to be technologically very innovative. And that was very interesting when I got this invitation. Then I was very happy to see that we will share these ideas about technological development and about these problems as well. So the United States was capable of doing some kinds of transformation, even when big challengers in the international system wanted to challenge the position of the United States. For example, in the 70s, or in the beginning of the 80s, or in the 80s with Japan, the United States was challenged by Japan, and if you just think on the microelectronics, and we just think on the way how Japan was able to extend the possibilities of its manufacturing industry, then the United States followed a very clever path, and he allowed for Japan to be big on consumer goods, but the real innovation remained at the United States. Or if we just think on the Chinese example now, I think it's very early to speak about the transformation of the international system, and the challenges of China is very clear, but I think the United States should not be concerned in the short term that China will challenge its positions. We know that, and if you just think on the innovation, we can say that the so-called innovation pool, which is needed to have a hegemonical power in the international system, could not be maintained by China now. So the soft innovation, which means that the ability to innovate or to be able to innovate on such territories as the management or companies or how these companies will produce the goods is just not China is not in the situation that this could be replacing the United States possibilities now. So I think from the other perspective, from Hungary's perspective, and from the perspective of the region, if we just think on the United States and we want to ask whether we need a very strong United States, I think the answer is a resounding yes. Of course, the United States fundamentally changed the politics of the European states after the Second World War. I think the European integration could not be the integration without the United States. Not just the European integration, but if you just think on the different member states of Europe, the United States transferred the foreign policy framework of Germany, Western Germany after, and transferred France foreign policy possibilities. Of course, there were other paths in the US and France relations, but we can say that the US successfully transferred these policies, these foreign policies, after the Second World War, and I think after the Cold War, this transformation is still not over. So if you just think on the NATO, we just think on the European Union's capabilities. And for example, the European Union is doing very hard work to create an own military policy. This military policy is challenged by the United States. Of course, we just do not want to replace or duplicate the capabilities of the NATO now, but the CFSP, the Common Foreign and Security Policy, the ESDP, was shaped by the way it cooperating with the United States and with the NATO. So even the biggest processes in the European integration are challenged by the United States now. So as for Hungary, what can we add to this situation? I think, as I said, one of the central questions to hegemony is the capability to innovate. And I think here where Hungary could be very strong, and if you just think on the past, Hungarian scientists and Hungarian people were at the positions where the United States economy was put on a new path, for example, during the Second World War, just think on the nuclear developments, and after that Hungary was very good on the different scientific fields which could be incorporated in the United States scientific programs. The other problem is that the hegemonical order, which is very good for a small middle size state as Hungary. So of course we have to avoid the free rider behavior in this sense, but it is very important for Hungary to have a stable international order, and of course we are belonging to, firstly, to the European Union, but I think the events of the international system is greatly shaped by the United States, and Hungary must find a good place in that international system. And finally, just some thoughts about the innovation circle and about all the processes which are currently occurring in the world economy. So it is very interesting to see. If you just want to do anything with your computer now, then just think on the programs and to the applications. Every program belongs to US company, Google or Facebook or Apple or Twitter, or these big systems are belonging to the United States companies. And it is very interesting to see the new trends in the international order. How, for example, the United States transforms back, and Apple transforms back the productive capabilities from China to the United States. So it is very interesting to see why these processes are occurring now, and I think that's an answer to the question whether the United States will be in a position to reinvent in case if the situation, the international situation, will change at this level. So I think I stop here, and we will discuss later all the necessary and interesting things which are in the book, and we can discuss here these. So thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've had two very interesting speeches, and I think also both speakers have been agreed upon the proposition that America is too innovative really to decline. So there seem to be you're united around that. But what I would like to ask first, Jim, this question is: anyone who bets against the innovation of American industry is going to lose. And I think we see the American economy coming back again and again when people haven't expected it. At the same time, the Canadian writer Mark Stein points out that America is the brokest nation in the world. It owes more to other countries through the T-bills than anyone else in history, so he argues, I think, and particularly the Chinese, so that in any struggle between China and Russia, he says, America is financing the armies on both sides. So what I'd like to know, therefore, is this: how does the innovation that's characteristic of America solve the overriding fiscal demographic problems that the critics of, that the predictors of American decline see? I mean, it seems to me, I see how it might happen in a particular state, but you've got enormous problems with Social Security, with the entitlement programs, with the budget. How does the innovation of industry solve that?
Well, if I can take the first crack at that. Historically, if you have a very large debt position, there are only three ways to deal with it. One is to cut back on your other expenditures, be frugal, and put a high percentage of your total worth into paying it back until it is paid back. The second, and historically most common way, is to default on the debt and screw your creditors. The third way, and this is done much less often in history because most people have never been able to do it, is to transform your productivity and become far wealthier than you were at the time that you incurred the debts, without keeping your level of indebtedness at the same scale as the increase in your productivity. The two very large debts in history that were paid off in full and fairly were the British debt after the Napoleonic Wars, which was, I think it was like over 300% of their GDP at the time. Maybe it was like 1,000% or something. It was enormous, which was paid off in gold on time, basically thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Britain's wealth became so enormous in the 3 or 4 decades following the Napoleonic Wars that they had no trouble paying off their obligations. And that they went back to the classical liberal 3 to 4% GDP running through the government, and they were quite happy to do so. The second one was the US debt after the Second World War, which similarly was paid off. It was enormous. Again, it was several 100% of GDP at the end of the war, and it was the post-war boom and the post-war technology-driven boom and the consumer expansion that made that possible. So the third and most pleasant way of paying off a debt is to grow so enormously wealthy that the debt becomes trivial. You buy a sandwich and then you pay the debt off with the change. Inflation does that too, but not in a nice way. My preference here is that the U.S. solves its current debt problem the same way. And the 3.0 transition in productivity, which will not only increase productivity, but it also, as a sort of a complementary thing, has the possibility of collapsing the cost of living enormously. Just as food and clothing in the United States have become far cheaper than they were 60 years ago, as a percentage of everybody's income, and some little items like ink pens, for instance, became so trivial that they basically became free. An ink pen used to be a prestige item that you got as a retirement present or something, and now banks give them away. This technology has the possibility of making this happen to all sorts of things that are currently scarce or luxury goods. Banks might give cars away as a prize in the future. Is this? I don't know. At any rate, yes, technology, productivity boom driven by technology innovation is the preferred way of dealing with the debt crisis, as long as we avoid using the rise in productivity to run our debt levels up even further, which is why the fiscal reforms that we discuss under the category of the big haircut in the book becomes critical.
Thank you. Now, my question to Dr. Gálik is derived from that. Europe has been very fortunate for the last 60 years in that America has basically provided its defense. It's perfectly true that under NATO, the Europeans contributed that, but I think we would agree that they didn't contribute to the degree that they should have done, and certainly not to the degree that they benefited. Now, if Europe is not going to be able to rely on America for its defense to that degree, because the Americans, in paying off their debt, are not be able to provide the same level of defense spending, how is Europe going to cope, given that it has it has the same fiscal problems as America, and with the additional one that it's also having to spend a lot of money to save the euro?
So that's a very interesting question, and if you just go back to history, then I think, and I have a lecture on the European defense history, and we always said that when Europe tried to create some regional settings in the past, just think on the Brussels Treaty, the Western European Union, or the Fouché plans, or other plans which were not formalized finally, they always kept in mind that what would happen to Europe if the United States would just withdraw because of the Vietnamese War or because of the Korean War. We just should proceed with something which is ours, or which is the Western European countries' own system. And I think now the European integration developed a kind of security framework, but this security framework was very hardly shaped by the United States. So I think the cooperation between the European member states are now limited to not just to the soft power side of the security process, but on some side of the hard security. But as you know, with the Petersburg tasks and with other things, we are very limited. And if you just think on the European Union, the European Union did not adopt the common defense. We have some kind of common solidarity, but not common defense. So that's a very hard question, how Europe would deal with these. And I think the capability of Europe would exist. And in recent years, we see that the process is just turned back. So with the French and British cooperation on military affairs, the multilateral framework was very loosened and went back to some kind of bilateral cooperation. And maybe Europe will be just more successful if we will create a different institutional setting. So we do not want to have a kind of federal Europe in this sense, but a kind of looser cooperation which stays at the national level.
Thank you. Could I invite people from the audience to put questions? And yes. May I offer you this? Because I think we're recording the whole thing, so thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Just for the sake of openness, I'm Andre, good friend of Chargé at the American Embassy, but this is United States, and also dividing it 1.0, 2.0. Let's say 1.0 is agrarian, small, localized cottage industries, less connected, yes. And then 2.0 is the industrialized, very central, good communication structures to be able to have large industries. And then 3.0 is, let's say, the current environment, decentralized distribution, very connected cottage industries that are able to collaborate internally and externally without the need for the same type of centralized management. That posits, let's say, a decentralized state, a resurgent America, because you don't need the strong state capability, but that you have a strong strata of interlinked peoples, industries that don't rely as much on centralized management. So are you arguing against the strong state model towards entities that are very decentralized and interlinked without actual states? And then that would go to Dr. Gálik. You were talking about the need for a strong US interacting with Europe. How does that work if we're talking about weak state models but strong 3.0 interlinked industries?
If you could keep that for a minute and pass it on in a minute. But so, Jim first and then...
Yes. Yes, we are talking about exactly that in terms of the industrial economic structure. In terms of government, what we are talking about is somewhat back to the original federal design. In other words, a federal government that is strong and capable in the spheres in which it's still essential for national defense, international relations, etc. And obviously this is more functions than was considered necessary, in 1789 to 1860, say. We're not going back that far with the state because we're still, for instance, calling for the retention of NATO and actually a sort of revitalization of NATO, which obviously requires a federal government large enough to create the defense capability needed to backstop it, although we do discuss procurement reform to decentralize and reshape the cost basis of the Defense Department, which we have quite a few recommendations on. But one of the things we call for is a decentralization of the social functions of the government. In other words, most of the social programs that are now financed at the federal level would return to either states or We call for special purpose compacts among the states to do regional entities to carry out some of the social functions. We point out that Americans have quite a bit of variance in what they want the state to do for them. And on the other hand, most of the really successful models, say, of strong welfare states, countries like Denmark or Sweden, do it actually at a relatively small scale, 4 to 9 million in those things. So we discuss a social framework which allows a good deal more decentralization of economic functions that are currently done at the federal level. So, but we aren't advocating a weak state in the sense of a state that doesn't have the ability to carry out the defense functions we consider critical, or the international relations functions, and some of the international financial role, for instance, that the U.S. has to carry out through some of the international organizations. So not entirely back to the pre-Civil War days, but less so than now or the New Deal.
Good. Thank you. Zoltán.
So, as for me, so I think Europe and the United States is very closely linked, and the dependence is very high with the two economies. If you just think on the world economic crisis or world financial crisis, then we can say that the United States is the hegemonic power, because the import market is the biggest one in the world. So the financial crisis just arrived to Europe within days, and to Hungary, because we are interlinked with Germany, and Germany is dependent on the American export. So I think it is very early to say if some very big change would occur in this system, then how it would be, how the system would be able to change the linkages or the dependencies. But I think in the short term we do not have to worry on that. So I don't see the trends in the situation whether this will change in the short term or in the middle term. So maybe in longer terms we should be worried about that, but I can't see now the reason.
Gentlemen.
So, while I have the microphone,
Yes.
thank you very much. I can make use of this. I'm the Japanese ambassador, and if I could ask a question from a slightly different angle. You talked about actually innovative capacity and so on and so forth, but what about the America's capacity in terms of ideology and values? And we have seen with the recent events in Ukraine and the consolidation of the powers between Europe, Japan, and America. This is a new incident. Then we also see in Asia, China struggling with pluralism and issues of fundamental human rights. They still have a long way to go. But then we also saw difficulties in the Arab Spring, how the ideology and common values really, if you like, sort of did not really live up to our hopes. So in that sense, US has led the world, particularly in the field of common values and ideology and system. And I wonder if the US would continue to be able to do that in the coming decades.
Yes, that's a very good question, and everything you point out is an accurate observation. I would say very generically, because I believe that the US is in a time of transition between the 2.0 system to the 3.0 system, a time of transition is also a time of confusion, because many people see the old system is not quite working the way it used to. They wonder whether the old values are also valid or not. The US government, the current administration, came in with an idea of they were going to transform US foreign policy in certain ways. And I think that they are finding out that their ideas were not very clear to begin with, and they have had difficulty applying them in a coherent fashion, possibly because they were not coherent to begin with. And this is typical of a time of transition. I believe that the US will eventually create a new iteration of its classical values. In other words, same values, maybe slightly different form and application. And once we are past the transition point and a new consensus has been arrived at, I think the US will be capable of acting clearly. For the short term, the lack of coherent thinking at the highest levels is a problem for the world because of the dependence of the world system as created on the US as power. And I think that we are seeing short term, for the rest of this administration, this will continue to be the case. I think opportunism on the part of certain foreign powers will lead them to adventures of the sort we've recently seen. It is somewhat a dangerous situation for the world because of that. And I hope, and part of what I advocate is that the US understand the transition and complete the restatement of its classical values, because I think the classical values are strong and appropriate to America, and they will work in the future to do what they did in the past. But they need a restatement at this time.
Zoltán, would you like to come in on this?
No, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Yes, gentleman there, then a gentleman.
Can I have 2 questions?
I suppose you can.
I would ask a question first. My question is for Mr. Bennett. You were talking about 3D printing and another technology which is promising in the future, and I think that opened me a question that I think copyrights and institution of intellectual property will or can be an obstacle to the growth of these technologies. And what's your take on the thing that maybe states will have more problem to ensure the copyrights and the institution of intellectual property? And I think that if we got rid of intellectual property, that would open up space and
there's a question mark there, isn't there?
there will be one.
Will
yes.
it open up space? Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
So yes, so the question is, do you see that as an obstacle of innovation or something that helps innovation?
Thank you.
I think that, first of all, you're right. The current state of intellectual property is a problem for innovators, and at a point where all the value of an object lies in the software that describes it rather than the physical object after it's produced, you can see why intellectual property rights become a huge thing. Now you have this model of collaborative production. For instance, the Unix community, the Linux community has shown that you can produce something without using intellectual property rights, and it can be a thing of value. Although I will notice that it was a thing originally created by the government out of tax money that they used as the basis of this, which was Unix. If you abolish all property rights, however, you also have a problem. And the problem is that people will not, in many cases, not contribute an innovation or a product, because unless they have another way of protecting the value they've created. Typically you do this by a license regime, and with strong cryptography you can create sort of a software box that you can put the thing in, and then you require a self-enforcing contract with anybody who uses it. And this method, it will be effective, but it can be cumbersome and impose transaction costs on the user, and in some ways it might end up being more restrictive than a old-fashioned copyright system. On the other hand, enforcement of an old-fashioned copyright system has become extremely difficult. So this is one of those things where I think a modified copyright system, a very basic copyright system, should still be in place. I don't like the digital rights management system that the US software or the US media industry has imposed on the United States, and this business of the regional licenses is ridiculous. I agree with you there. So I think it'll be a fine art to create a new intellectual property system. It will be necessary to reform the intellectual property system, It will have some features of the current copyright system, but I think much shorter copyright times. Now, as an author who personally profits from the copyright system, I have mixed feelings about this. But frankly, the royalties have never been very big, so that's not necessarily a reason for doing it. But I think you will see much more free collaborative production like Linux. I think you will see the digital rights management system being beat way back in the near-term future. Much more piracy, much more free production. So it's a big challenge. There's no one simple answer. It's a good question.
We'll ask the question, Jim, when you've written a bestseller. The gentleman.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Kish. I'm from the Ministry of Defense of Hungary, and my question goes to Professor Gálik. You mentioned that in the past the US may have negatively influenced European defense policy or the creation of a unified European defense policy. How do you see right now what the US could do to positively influence the development of such a policy, especially in light of the fiscal pressures in the US, the US pivot to Asia, and of course the recent developments in Ukraine? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just do not remember whether I said that the US negatively influenced. I just said that the United States had some impact on the way the European defense cooperation took or was formulated in the last 15 years. So I think the European system evolved on a two-pillar system, the transatlantic and the regional one. And I said that this regional cooperation was always challenged by the United States. So it was not a negative. Sometimes it just helped to institutionalize the cooperation. So I don't know whether this answers. Yeah, so I think if we just look at the way the United States is redoing its business in the defense industry, and we just take a look on the defense strategies of the United States in 2002, 2006, 2010, and the Quadrennial Defense Review, we saw that the United States just reallocating the forces within Europe and towards the Far East. So there's a concern that maybe the United States just will create a very different situation in the defense system of Europe. And of course, I think it will put Europe in a position when some days she will have to decide whether to go alone with creating a much effective European defense system or not. But I think it won't occur next week. So I think we still have time to rethink whether what kind of institutionalized cooperation is good for Europe. So, and maybe it's not a federal way, it's maybe a very intergovernmental way or a nation-based system, and that would be good for defense and for the soft cooperation as well for Europe.
Thank you. This will have to be the last question, the lady right at the back.
Okay, so my question would be about innovation, because I was surprised that both of you mentioned innovation as the basic of America's superpower right now. And my question would be, who are the drivers in the economy, like not nationwide, but in economy-wide of innovation? Because there are two things in my mind. One is the startup companies, because at Hungary, nowadays I always hear that Hungary wants to strengthen startup companies because it's the driver of innovation and economic growth. But on the other hand, I work as a technology infrastructure analyst at a multinational company, and we are always advertising that we are very innovative. So and we have, the money to be innovative, while startups can fail. So my question would be, what do you think, does America has to strengthen the environment for startup companies and innovation, or they have to strengthen the trust in multinational companies' innovation?
A very simple question. Startups or multinationals, which are the better from the standpoint of state concern? Actually, I'm going to ask Zoltán to answer that question. Then both of you perhaps could make this also your summing up.
Okay.
All right. So I think if we just want to go into details, then first we should analyze from the hegemonical perspective, and we can say that soft innovation and hard innovation is not the same. And I think the United States has now enough power on both sides to maintain the lead before. And I think if you just think on the small enterprises, we can say that the US has a very healthy ecosystem on that field. So, and I just read, I don't know where, an essay which said that the need of time in which a very small firm could be profitable and could create money is much shorter than in the past. So I don't know which institution was it, or it was in The Economist, or I don't know where, but that time is very limited now, and compared to the one before decades, for 40 years or 30 years or 20 years, now we are speaking about just years, so 5 years or something like that. So, and we can see the case of the voice chat application, which Facebook just bought last week. It was not the Snapchat, but yeah. So that's it for $18 billion. So.
Okay. Thank you very much, James.
Yes, that's a very interesting question, and I can tell that you're talking from real-world experience. So I'll give you an answer from real-world experience. My rocket company was approached toward the end of its time by General Electric Corporation, which, as you know, is one of the largest corporations in the United States and the richest. They wanted to buy us, and we then spent a year and a half negotiating with them, and us reviewing us, which required the generation of an enormous amount of paperwork by us to them for no money. And at the end of the time, they said they liked the technology, they liked us, but they weren't going to buy us because we didn't have enough people to fill out all the forms needed to report to their headquarters. And this was typical. Now, that decision cost me several $1 million personally, but let's bygones be bygones, and it illustrates the whole problem here, is that small companies move fast because they are not burdened by the bureaucracy. And this is an American company. A European company has more bureaucracy than the American companies do. Yeah, somebody's looking dubious, and you're probably right. But some American corporations have an enormous amount of bureaucracy. This is the problem everywhere. It's a transaction cost problem, and the smaller the company, the lower the transaction costs within it, which is why most companies and most jobs are created at the small company level. Historically, the way to deal with this has been to make it easier for small companies to raise money. If I'm going to suggest one reform to make it easier to have more startup companies in any country, that is to loosen the regulation of the investment finance into it. Every time the US tightens its regulatory rules, it kills an entire generation of companies, and the opportunity costs of the companies that never get started are even larger. Europe, I would suggest the same thing. Government loans, government help does not substitute for private capital. Private capital brings not only the money itself, but it brings interested parties who usually have useful advice and connections. Government money brings bureaucracy and bureaucratic compliance, which actually makes your company less competitive. And the more money it has to waste, the less competitive it becomes typically. So the historical pattern of easy financing, lots of startups, lots of failures of startups, and the ability to tolerate failure is an extremely important part of that. If there's a cultural change that you could make to be more friendly towards entrepreneurs, it would be to change your attitude towards failure and bankruptcy. And in Silicon Valley, basically a person who has started 3 companies, all of which have failed, is considered to be highly, a very good person to fund a 4th startup, because they figure you have made all your mistakes at somebody else's expense, and now you can come in and get the benefit of that. And you know, this is actually the way it works. So those are things that would help greatly in startups, and it's another reason why a fluid, pro-innovation culture is probably the fundamental requirement for a successful, innovative culture. And the money problem is real. The other things are the number of days it takes to go from start to actually having a functioning company in terms of bureaucratic approvals, licenses you get. Singapore is down to 1 day and you can do it all online. That is the example to follow. Don't follow America, follow Singapore in that particular regard. But it used to be that way in America. It still is in the state of Wyoming. California is worse than Peru these days, and it is paying the price in terms of loss of startups in anything except software. So I would say, yeah, you're not going to get away from that. You just have to get to a situation where hopefully your startups will be able to start up, and then when they get large enough, the multinationals can buy them for a huge profit to their founders. And that will be an example for the others.